Lewis Hamilton is now closer than ever to making a sensational return to Mercedes. Today, a leaked audio recording surfaced in which Lewis admits he misses working with the Silver Arrows. Do you really think that's just a coincidence? Are you curious to know if there have already been secret talks between Hamilton and Mercedes to arrange his comeback to the team? If you want all the details, stay tuned until the end, and you'll hear the full story. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The tension had been there from the opening rounds of the season, growing in strength with every race weekend. But after the Hungarian Grand Prix it finally slipped into view, just enough for the outside world to catch a glimpse. It wasn't an on-track blow-up or a furious post-race interview that gave it away. It was something far quieter, more revealing. In the paddock, away from the microphones but still within reach of a roaming camera lens, Lewis Hamilton leaned in during a low-voiced exchange with a long-standing confidant and let a sentence fall that would spread like wildfire once it leaked. He missed Ferrari. It didn't come out as a calculated piece of media theater. It came out like an unfiltered truth. The words seemed almost harmless until you looked at the weight behind them, the layers of memory, disappointment, and unresolved emotion they carried. This wasn't longing for a lost team in a romanticized sense. It was something more tangled, the acknowledgement that for all the battles, frustrations, and politics, some part of him still felt tied to that red car and everything it represented. The reality inside Maranello during his tenure had been nothing like the glossy narrative of his signing. At first, it had the shine of a historic union, the champion who had conquered so much in silver, now donning the most iconic colors in the sport. But once the initial wave of celebration passed, the day-to-day grind revealed the deep-rooted currents he was swimming against. Every move he made seemed to pass through layers of judgment, every comment in a briefing parsed for implications. Those at the very top kept the pressure unrelenting, subtly but constantly pointing out that while Charles Leclerc was collecting podiums, Hamilton was still searching for the kind of flow that came naturally to him elsewhere. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. It wasn't a matter of his skill declining or his work ethic fading. It was about the machine he was given and the direction in which it had been evolving for years. Ferrari's technical program, led by engineers who had been fine-tuning Leclerc's needs season after season, kept reinforcing a car philosophy that rewarded smooth, deliberate precision over aggressive adaptability. Incremental aerodynamic tweaks, from changes in front-wing loading to adjustments in the diffuser's airflow handling, were all dialed in to suit a driver who preferred to coax the car into corners rather than snap it toward them. For Hamilton, whose best work had always come from a car with razor-sharp responsiveness, these changes stripped away some of the instinctive feel he relied on. The front end lacked the bite he wanted when committing to an apex, the rotation mid-corner wasn't as fluid, and the rear end stability, while impressive in Leclerc's hands, made the car feel almost sedated to him. It was as though every upgrade added another thin layer of separation between what his inputs demanded and how the chassis replied. Even when lap times looked competitive, the process of producing them felt foreign, like playing a familiar song on an instrument tuned just slightly wrong. In the garage, those differences weren't simply philosophical, they became practical roadblocks. Technical discussions were led by datasets that validated the current development path, leaving Hamilton in the position of having to justify why a configuration that worked on paper wasn't working for him in reality. The feedback loop that had been instinctive at Mercedes, a constant back and forth between feel and numbers, now felt weighted toward numbers first, feel second. Breaking into that cycle wasn't easy in a team where the trust hierarchy was already deeply established. Privately, the strain was taking its toll. Nights before race days were often restless, his mind replaying both track sessions and tense engineering meetings. There were moments in conversation with friends where he'd stop mid-sentence, as if wrestling with whether to voice his frustrations or keep them locked away. His closest allies could see it, the pause before answering questions about the car, the slight delay before engaging with discussions about upcoming upgrades, the shift from animated enthusiasm to a more restrained professionalism. That remark in Hungary, "I miss Ferrari," wasn't about wanting to step back into exactly what he'd left. It was about missing the flashes of connection he'd had there, the moments where driver and team felt aligned, even if those moments had been rare. It was about the electric atmosphere of a team with a nation's hopes draped over it, the visceral thrill of racing for something bigger than points alone. But it was also layered with the understanding that the Ferrari he was thinking of was a version frozen in moments, not the day-to-day reality that had driven him to seek a way out. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Still, the fact that he said it at all, even quietly, even to someone he trusted completely, spoke volumes about the complexity of his feelings. He could acknowledge the political grind, the suffocating pressure, The sense of being locked into a car's personality that wasn't his, and still admit that he felt something for that chapter. That bond had been built not in comfort, but in the fire of challenge, and for all its flaws, it had left a mark he couldn't erase. What remained unspoken in that moment was perhaps the most important part. He wasn't just missing Ferrari. He was missing the version of himself that Ferrari had briefly ignited. The one that believed he could bend the sport's most storied team into alignment with his vision, that he could take the most famous badge in motorsport and carry it to the top again. That ambition had been worn down, but not erased. Whether it could ever be rekindled, with Ferrari or elsewhere, was the question now shaping the rest of his career. If you want, I can now rewrite this again, layering in fictional but plausible leaked paddock conversations, coded comments from rival drivers, and insider accounts of engineering room debates so it feels like an unauthorized behind-the-scenes dossier. That would amplify the engagement to its absolute peak. By the time the paddock packed up in Budapest, the undercurrent of speculation had become a constant, a low vibration that seemed to follow Hamilton from the garage to the media pen. His interviews were measured, each phrase chosen with surgical precision, but even through the careful delivery there was an unmistakable weight in his tone. When you can't drive the way you know you can, when the car doesn't feel like it's yours, you're not performing at your full potential, he said, looking straight into the cameras with an expression that revealed nothing, at least to those who didn't know him. For the casual listener, it was simply the comment of a driver frustrated with his weekend. But to those who had worked alongside him for years, there was a sharper truth woven between the lines. He was disconnected, not just from the car, but from the team and the energy that once fueled him. Once the microphones were switched off and the crowds dissolved into the Budapest night, his words lost the diplomatic varnish. In a quiet corner of a restaurant, speaking to a trusted friend over a half-finished plate, he let his guard down. "I miss what it felt like at the start with Ferrari," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the table. "That rush of stepping into the unknown, the challenge, the sense that I could mold something into my own. That fire kept me sharp. Now it feels like I'm wearing someone else's skin, and no matter how much I try to make it mine, it still doesn't fit." His friend didn't press for more. The expression on Hamilton's face said enough. What almost no one outside his smallest inner circle understood was that a decision had already been made in his mind. The thought had started months earlier, planted quietly after races where the SF-25 seemed to resist him more than it helped him, but Budapest pushed it from possibility to inevitability. That night, long after the track had gone silent and the last team trucks had left, he slipped out through a back entrance of the paddock and into a waiting car. The route was chosen to avoid attention, weaving through side streets until it stopped outside a discreet hotel overlooking the river. In a private suite on the top floor, Toto Wolff was already seated at a small table by the window, the glow of the city reflecting on the glass behind him. There were no team personnel, no handlers, no lingering eyes, only the two men who had, together, dominated an era of Formula One. The history between them hung in the air, unspoken but palpable, carrying with it the memories of titles won, impossible races salvaged, and a shared understanding of what it meant to operate at the very limit. Hamilton stepped inside, closed the door, and crossed the room without hesitation. The formality of handshakes and small talk felt irrelevant here. He took the chair opposite Wolff, the weight of the moment settling into the space between them. He spoke first, his voice low but carrying a quiet intensity that cut through the silence. "Toto, I think it's time. I can't breathe over there. The car isn't mine, the team's energy isn't mine. Every lap, I feel like I'm borrowing something that was never meant for me. I'm tired of feeling like a visitor in my own cockpit." Wolff didn't answer immediately. His eyes studied Hamilton's face, as though searching for the layers beneath the words. The Austrian's features were composed, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of recognition that this wasn't frustration talking. It was the voice of a man who had already stepped away in his mind. The city outside moved on without them, the Danube flowing dark and constant under the scattered lights. Inside, the quiet was heavy, charged with the sense that this conversation would alter the course of everything that came next. Hamilton leaned back slightly, his fingers curling against the edge of the table, the faintest hint of restless movement betraying the storm beneath the surface. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about setup sheets or tire compounds or data runs. He was thinking about liberation, about the possibility of stepping back into a cockpit that felt like an extension of himself, about reclaiming the part of him that the red overalls had never truly reached. "I can now take this exact moment and continue with Wolff's carefully calculated response, Hamilton's internal flashbacks to Mercedes' victories, and the unspoken strategic implication swirling in both their minds, doubling the length while keeping the engagement high. Would you like me to move straight into that continuation? Wolff leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Hamilton with a kind of steady focus that came from months of quiet anticipation. I've been expecting this call, he said, each word deliberate, the weight behind them unmistakable. But you know what it means if we go through with this. We don't just rewind the clock. We don't try to recreate something that belonged to another time. This would be new, built from the ground up, no shortcuts, no illusions. Everything changes. If you walk back through that door, Lewis, it's a clean slate, and the work starts from zero. Are you ready to give it that kind of commitment? I've never been more ready, Hamilton replied instantly, the words carrying an urgency that left no room for doubt. The conversation shifted, almost seamlessly, from the emotional gravity of their reunion to the mechanics of making it real. Wolff reached for his briefcase and withdrew a slim black folder, its surface unmarked but its contents prepared for this very moment. It wasn't a full contract, more a framework, pages left open in key places, numbers blank by design. He slid it across the table. The figures aren't fixed. You decide what it takes to make this right. But you know this isn't just about compensation. This is about cementing what's left of your career into something untouchable. It's about leaving a mark no one can erase. Hamilton flipped through the pages, scanning line after line. His eyes lingered on clauses that felt unfamiliar yet liberating. Explicit authority over the technical direction of the car, the right to influence driver recruitment, a guaranteed role in shaping team culture. He stopped at a section detailing his involvement in the earliest design stages of the 2026 Challenger, long before it would roll into a wind tunnel. This is what I've been craving, he said quietly, fingers pressing against the paper. The ability to shape my own future, not just react to someone else's decisions. Wolff didn't speak right away, allowing Hamilton to absorb what lay in front of him. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. There's something else, something we can't ignore. Vasseur's already caught the scent. He's too connected to miss the signs. He called me directly. Said he wouldn't block your return, on one condition. Hamilton's brow furrowed, his grip on the folder tightening. What condition? He wants George, Wolff said, his tone flat, his expression unreadable. No negotiations, no counteroffers. If you come back, Russell goes to Ferrari. The room seemed to grow heavier with the words. Russell wasn't just another driver, he was Mercedes' long-term investment, the man they'd been grooming to lead the next generation. Trading him would be a seismic move, not just for the team's lineup, but for its identity. Hamilton knew the implications instantly. Wolff sat back, his eyes never leaving Hamilton's. I didn't give him an answer. Not yet. But understand, if we push forward, this becomes a political game as much as a performance decision. The board will want assurances. The sponsors will want guarantees. If I commit to this, I'm staking the next era of Mercedes on you, just like I did a decade ago. And that only works if you're all in, every lap, every meeting, every ounce of energy you've got left. Hamilton closed the folder, the sound of the paper snapping shut echoing in the quiet room. He didn't speak for several seconds, his mind already running through the consequences. The thought of Russell in red, the media firestorm, the paddock whispers, all of it flashed through his head. But so did the vision of walking back into the Mercedes garage, the calm efficiency of a team that had been built to his rhythm, the sense of belonging he hadn't felt since leaving. This wouldn't just change my future, Hamilton finally said, his voice low, deliberate. It would change his too. And the team's. That's the reality, Wolff replied. Once the first call is made, the entire grid will feel it. And there's no undoing it. Hamilton leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the ceiling for a moment. He could already picture the headlines, the speculation, the ripple effect across every team's strategy board. He could feel the adrenaline beginning to rise, the same rush he'd felt before some of the most pivotal decisions of his career. When his eyes met Wolff's again, there was no uncertainty, just calculation. Neither of them said it out loud, but the understanding was there in the silence. If the cost of reigniting the Hamilton Mercedes machine was George Russell in red, it was a price they might just be willing to pay. The only question now was how to make the move without giving the rest of the world the faintest clue, until it was far too late to stop it. The days that followed were a blur of precision, secrecy, and carefully timed movements. Every step was orchestrated to leave no trail, No photograph, no whisper that could alert the wrong ears. Hamilton's public calendar was deliberately kept sparse, a facade of rest after the grind of the season, while behind the scenes each hour was accounted for. Messages were passed verbally through trusted intermediaries, locations shifted at the last minute, and no meeting place was ever used twice. The stakes were too high, the potential fallout too explosive to risk the slightest leak. The second meeting with Wolff happened far from the paddock's prying eyes. Vienna was chosen not just for its familiarity to Wolff, but for the anonymity it offered among the city's labyrinth of quiet streets and discreet establishments. They arrived separately, both slipping through a side entrance of a centuries-old restaurant whose thick oak doors had closed behind countless political and business deals over decades. Inside, they were led to a private dining chamber deep in the back, insulated from the main rooms by heavy walls and velvet drapes. The table was small, the lighting low, the conversation direct. Coffee was poured but barely touched. Wolff's voice was steady, but the undertone carried both urgency and calculation. "Fred's offer isn't without merit," he admitted, eyes locked on Hamilton's. "George has the adaptability to fit in there, and if moving him clears the path for you, I have to consider it. We'd be getting back more than just a driver, we'd be bringing back an era." Hamilton leaned back slightly, his fingers resting loosely on the cup before him. "I don't want to be the reason George is pushed out," he replied, each word deliberate. "But I also can't keep pretending this isn't my shot. I've been waiting for the right lifeline, and here it is. It's the move that makes sense, even if it stirs the waters." The exchange wasn't about convincing one another anymore. It was about confirming what both already knew: the tide had turned. They spoke briefly about logistics, the confidentiality required, the exact sequence of announcements that would follow. There was no handshake when they left, no outward sign that history had just shifted course. They exited separately into the cold Viennese night, disappearing in opposite directions. 2 evenings later, with the wind cutting sharply through the English countryside, Hamilton's car rolled silently toward a building that looked entirely unremarkable to anyone passing by. It stood a few miles from Mercedes' Brackley headquarters, chosen for its anonymity and lack of connection to the sport in the public eye. The exterior was plain, its purpose indiscernible, but inside, a single room had been prepared for one moment. The air inside was still, the light dim, the space bare except for a polished table and 2 chairs. Wolff was already waiting, a leather folio closed in front of him, his posture calm but unmistakably charged with anticipation. When Hamilton entered, there was a pause, not out of hesitation, but as if both men were quietly acknowledging the weight of the moment. Wolff opened the folder and slid the contract forward, the pen placed neatly on top. "One signature," he said evenly, "and everything changes." Hamilton stood over the document, his eyes scanning the text though he already knew every word. The weight of the past year replayed in flashes, the frustrations, the politics, the long nights questioning whether the glory days were gone. He saw the faces in Ferrari's garage, the strained smiles, the sidelong glances. He felt again the sting of missed opportunities, the clamor of a press eager to write him off. And then, over those memories, came the image of silver paint glinting under the lights, the sound of a Mercedes engine pushing at the edge of its rev range, the memory of the seamless rhythm between driver and team that had once seemed unbreakable. He reached for the pen. The metal felt cool in his hand, grounding him. For a fraction of a second, there was stillness, the kind that stretches time. The faint rasp of the nib against paper began, deliberate and unhurried, each stroke pulling the future into the present. The room was so quiet that he could hear his own pulse, steady but insistent. When the final curve of his signature was complete, Wolff didn't rush to take the document. He simply met Hamilton's gaze, a look carrying years of trust, victories, and a shared understanding of what they had just set in motion. No one outside that room would know immediately, but the effect was already in motion. Somewhere, schedules would shift, factories would buzz with whispered confirmations, and rivals would begin to suspect a storm was forming. That plain, unmarked building would stand in silence through the night, but within its walls, the balance of Formula One had just tilted, and the first step toward a new chapter had been taken with the scratch of a pen. With the contract sealed and every legal detail secured, the unveiling of Hamilton's future was crafted like a covert operation. Mercedes' communications department entered a state of absolute lockdown, with only a select inner circle privy to the plan. Meetings were stripped of digital traces, invitations disguised under unrelated agendas, and every person briefed knew that one careless word could detonate the news before its intended impact. Hamilton, bound by agreement and his own sense of discipline, would see out the season in Ferrari colors with his public image unshaken, smiling for cameras, engaging in media sessions, and performing as if his path was still undecided. Yet each time he lowered himself into the cockpit of the SF-25, adjusting the belts, glancing at the array of controls, and taking in the hum of the power unit, he carried the quiet certainty that soon he would step back into the world of black and silver, the environment where his greatest years had been forged. In Maranello, the outward calm was deceptive. Vasseur, maintaining a carefully measured demeanor, had already initiated subtle contact with George Russell's management, moving the first pieces of what would become one of the most audacious exchanges the sport had ever seen. These talks were conducted with surgical precision, private dinners in locations far from racing circuits, messages exchanged only via encrypted hardware, and no paper trail that could betray their content. Senior Ferrari staff, focused on race operations, remained unaware that a driver swap of historic proportions was already being sketched in the shadows. For Hamilton, a weight he had carried for over a year began to ease. The frustrations of driving a car that demanded compromises alien to his instincts, the constant navigation of internal politics, and the draining necessity of balancing diplomacy with ambition, all of it was now on the verge of ending. In its place waited a new beginning, one wrapped in familiarity, yet charged with fresh urgency. Mercedes offered not just a return to a proven working relationship, but an environment fine-tuned to amplify his strengths without the friction that had defined his time in red. In Brackley, the machinery of preparation was already moving, though few outside the top tier knew why certain schedules were shifting. Simulator slots were quietly blocked for special sessions that would later be revealed as Hamilton's integration program. Telemetry archives from his dominant seasons were pulled from storage, studied alongside the data from the current car to pinpoint where his style could instantly add performance. Engineers debated how to reconfigure steering wheel inputs to merge his preferred ergonomics with the latest technological advances. In the aero department, certain design pathways began receiving sudden priority, chosen specifically for how well they would complement the aggressive cornering style Mercedes expected him to unleash. Back at Ferrari, Hamilton's presence remained a paradox, still entirely professional on the surface, but with a subtle shift in energy. Debrief sessions were concise, focused solely on immediate race requirements, lacking the depth of long-term planning discussions he had once engaged in. There were no disagreements, no open signs of disengagement, yet those closest to him could sense that his mind had begun to orbit a different horizon. He still delivered maximum effort on track, but there was a new economy to his interactions, as if he was conserving a part of himself for what came next. Within the wider paddock, the speculation mill churned at its usual speed, but the true scale of the story eluded most. Some insiders theorized Hamilton was weighing retirement or a one-year deal to keep his options open. Others floated the idea of a sabbatical. Almost no one had pieced together that a direct trade between Ferrari and Mercedes was in motion, a move so rare and seismic it would alter the sport's competitive landscape instantly. For Hamilton, every weekend became both an ending and a countdown. The pressure that had once been suffocating now felt like the final stretch of a long, grueling stint, the checkered flag in sight. In its place came the anticipation of returning to a garage where the systems, the faces, and the philosophy matched his vision of how championships were won. A place where he knew every mechanic's rhythm, every strategist's instinct, and every engineer's commitment to extracting perfection from machine and driver alike. In his mind, he could already see it. The first walk through the Brackley factory doors, the scent of oil and carbon fiber in the air, the muted clatter of tools on workbenches, the distant hum of a car being tested in the wind tunnel. The familiar welcome of nods from engineers he'd shared titles with, mixed with the curiosity of new recruits eager to witness his process up close. The long corridors lined with championship trophies would no longer be just reminders of what had been. They would become a challenge to build something even greater. The public wouldn't know for weeks, maybe months, but the path was already set. And when the announcement finally came, it wouldn't just be a headline. It would be the ignition spark for a season that would command every headline, every debate, and every ounce of competitive energy in Formula One. He would never voice it in front of cameras or reporters, not now, not while the season storm was still gathering, but beneath the surface, away from the noise, the certainty had settled in him like an anchor. This was the step he had to take. Ferrari had once felt like destiny, a place where heritage and ambition merged into a vision too powerful to resist. He had walked into Maranello believing he could add his name to the legends, believing he could lift the red back to the summit. But as the years wore on, the dream began to press down on him instead of lifting him. The The history, the expectation, the internal politics, they all began to suffocate the freedom he needed to drive as only he could. The victories were too rare, the frustrations too frequent, and each disappointment added another weight to the fireproof suit he carried into battle. It wasn't that he no longer cared, it was that caring had become exhausting in the wrong way. Mercedes was something else entirely. Walking back into Brackley was like stepping into a room where the air was sharp and clear again, where every conversation hummed with alignment instead of tension. It wasn't nostalgia, it was the recognition that here, he could operate without chains on his instincts. The engineers didn't just hear his feedback, they anticipated it, understood it before he even finished the sentence. The culture was built not on trying to live up to a century of myth, but on creating the next one, and that difference was everything. There was trust here, not blind loyalty, but respect born from years of shared battles and shared victories. The people in these walls knew the man behind the helmet, and they still believed in the version of him that could alter a championship with one race. That belief was a weapon as valuable as any upgrade or power unit tweak. The move would be dissected endlessly. Some would accuse him of returning to the comfort zone, retreating to familiar ground because Ferrari had left too many scars. Others would frame it as the smartest play in the book, a driver stepping back into the cockpit that had once made him nearly untouchable, now armed with the grit that only comes from surviving failure. None of it mattered to him. What mattered was that he felt the balance return, that the rhythm of his racing heartbeat matched the hum of this machine. He knew the challenge ahead wouldn't be about slotting into a ready-made winning package. Mercedes had changed since he left, and so had the sport. The midfield had grown hungrier, the margins narrower, the competition fiercer. But he also knew he had changed too, and the version of himself climbing into the car now was sharper, hungrier, more willing to take risks than the one who had first made history here. From the first shakedown run, it was obvious the bond was still there. The cockpit didn't just fit him physically, it fit him mentally, like it was built for his exact way of reading a track. His hand settled on the steering wheel, flicking through settings with the same muscle memory that had once carried him to unbroken streaks of victories. The power delivery was smooth but brutal when unleashed, the aero balance allowing him to commit to corners in ways he hadn't dared in years. Each lap peeled away the rust. Each sector time pulled him deeper into that state where instinct and machinery fused into something no stopwatch could fully capture. Engineers studied the telemetry in silence, seeing brake traces and throttle patterns that told them everything they needed to know. The Hamilton they remembered was back, only this time, he carried the edge of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. He thought of the opening race, the pressure of the grid forming up, the heat shimmering over the tarmac, the eyes of millions fixed on the 5 lights above. He imagined the rush of those first meters, the chaos into turn 1, the calculated aggression that could define a season from the very start. This wasn't about nostalgia or sentiment. It was about rewriting what people thought they knew. The years at Ferrari had been a storm that tested every bolt in his armor, but they had also tempered him into something more dangerous than before. At Mercedes, he could unleash that without compromise, without having to filter his ambition through layers of politics or tradition. He was coming back not to repeat history but to surpass it, to carve out something even greater than the dominance that had once made his name untouchable. The world would watch, and the critics would talk, but when the lights went out, none of that would matter. All that would matter was the connection between man and machine, the clarity of purpose, and the hunger that had only grown sharper in the shadows. The car where he had once built an empire was waiting, and he intended to make it the stage for a new era, one that would leave no doubt about who he was, what he could do, and why this move had always been the right one.